So after this first exorcism comes the event where Jesus goes into Simon Peter's house and heals Peter's mother. And it's not just Jesus going, it's all of those disciples so far going into Peter's house. And after that healing, he heals a lot of people and casts out a lot of demons because it's now realized he can do that. So a lot of people come by to be helped. Matthew, again, just skips this because it goes right from him calling Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Verse 22, and they immediately left the ship and their father and followed him, goes into, and Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom, healing all manner of sickness and all manner of disease. Right now we are at verse 29, and forthwith when they were come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon. But that portion in Matthew isn't mirrored here in Mark until 39. And he preached in their synagogues throughout all Galilee and cast out devils. And in Luke, we left off in 37, and the fame of him went out into every place of the country round about. After that, 38, he arose out of the synagogue and entered into Simon's house, but that portion where he's preaching through all Galilee doesn't happen until 44, and it says he preached in the synagogues of Galilee. So there's a portion in Mark and Luke that continues where Matthew drops off. As I will soon realize, Matthew does not record events in chronological order. And this event is not only in Mark 1 and Luke 4, but also in Matthew 8, even though I've only gotten to Matthew 4 so far. For now, I will only be combining the events from Mark and Luke, but you will see indicators of where the words are also in Matthew or are changed to fit with Matthew, because the screenshots are of the completed project. At the end, I will identify all the words and phrases that are also in Matthew, but the sentence structure remains almost exactly the same. So now, again, between Mark and Luke, the very next thing that happens is Mark 1:29, and forthwith, when they were come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon. Luke, and he arose out of the synagogue and entered into Simon's house. So, how to start? And he arose out of the synagogue, verses, and forthwith, when they were come out of the synagogue. So I guess I should put Luke first. Arising out of the synagogue comes before they are come out of the synagogue. And he arose out of the synagogue, comma, then I can go to Mark, and forthwith, when they were come out of the synagogue. No, I want to combine out of the synagogue. So I could say, and he arose, and forthwith, when they were come out of the synagogue. There, that's how I'll do it. And he arose, then over to Mark, and forthwith when they were come, and then both out of the synagogue. That's how I'll do it. So starting with Luke, and he arose, and then over to Mark. There's no comma or period, so it's going to be a little strange, but so far I think that's the best way to make it fit. Forthwith, when they were come, is Mark, and they were come, now both out of the synagogue, comma, they entered into the house of Simon, synagogue, comma, and entered into Simon's house. I can't begin with and, because that's how it started the sentence. I would have to continue with they entered into the house of Simon. They from Mark. They entered into the house of Simon and entered into, so entered into is both. Entered into the house of Simon, Simon's house. Simon's house. The house of Simon. I really want to simplify it. I'll say Simon's house. No, because then they might accuse me of cutting out the and the word of. Okay, I'll put all the words. The house is both, of is Mark, of Simon. So it's pretty much the verse goes as it is in Mark and Andrew with James and John. So actually, it's better from Mark because in Luke it just says into Simon's house. And they totally ignore the fact that it's also Andrew's house. Whereas in Mark, they say into the house of Simon and Andrew. Okay, well then in that case, I'm glad. Simon and Andrew. So this is just Mark, Simon and Andrew. With James and John from Mark. Oh, and it just ignores James and John in Luke. Okay, well in that case, yeah, I'm really glad. Simon and Andrew with James and John. Period. But Simon's wife's mother in Luke and Simon's wife's mother. I think because there's so many ands up until now, I'm going to go with the word but from Mark instead of and from Luke. So, okay, just Mark. But Simon's wife's mother lay sick. Simon's wife's mother was taken with a great fever. Okay, that's way more descriptive. From both Simon's wife's mother lay sick of a fever. Okay, so it's not quite as bad. Lay sick of a fever, and anon, it's been a long time since I've read that word, and anon, they tell him of her, and was taken with a great fever, and they besought him for. Okay, so I'm going to stick with how they're going to explain the fever. Was taken with a great fever, or lay sick of a fever. So was taken, lay sick, was taken with, lay sick of a great, lay sick, I could say lay sick of a great fever, was taken with a great fever. I think sick is better than taken. Lay sick with a great fever, or lay sick of a great fever. Lay sick with a great fever, lay sick with a great fever, lay sick of a great fever. I think with a great fever. Lay sick with a great fever. Yeah, I think that's how I'm going to do it. Lay sick with a great fever. So lay sick of a great fever. Lay sick. I'll say lay sick from Mark. Definitely that one. Of a great fever. Now with. I'm definitely going to go with. With a great fever. So with a, lay of a fever. So with from Luke, from both. Great is from Luke. And then both fever, comma. And anon. I like that a lot. I want to put that. And anon, they tell him. Oh, I like that. I'll continue from Mark. And, oh, look at that. And is from both. Anon from Mark. They is in Luke. They is in Mark. So both. They. Besought is in Luke. Tell him of her is in Mark. Besought him for her, or tell him of her. Besought him for her is way better. Because telling him of her is equivalent to just informing him she's sick, but besought him for her is actually, as is underlined here, entreated him to heal her. So they're actually asking him to do something. Besought is way more descriptive. Or I could say both. They tell him of her, and they besought him for her. No, tell him of her. I think I'm just going to put besought. And I'll just put besought instead of tell him of. Besought from Luke only. Him for her. Tell him. Okay, him is in both. For her. For is from Luke, as opposed to of her in Mark. So for is Luke. Her is in both. Luke continues, and he stood over her. Mark, and he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. He stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her, and immediately she arose. Okay, so before he took her by the hand, he rebuked the fever. So that has to come first. Because after he rebuked the fever, it says, and it left her, and immediately she arose. So he rebuked the fever first, which means he stood over her first. Wait a minute. And he came and took her by the hand, and stood over her, and rebuked the fever, and left her, and immediately she arose, and he took her by the hand. In Mark it says he lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her. So it's like he lifted her up at the same time, or just before the fever left her. But in Luke it says he stood over, he rebuked the fever, it left her, and immediately she... Okay, so the fact that it left her and she rose up, it's surrounding but switched the word immediately. So how about this? When she stood up, it was the exact moment that the fever left her. Like in the process of standing up. When she's laying down, 0%. Halfway standing up, 50%. By the time she's fully standing up, she's 100% healed. So, because it's surrounding the word immediately between Mark and Luke. Came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her. And it left her, and immediately she rose up. Oh, I'm just going to have to pick. One or the other. Whether he lifted her up first, and then saying immediately she arose. I think it's better for Mark. Took her by the hand, and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her. As opposed to, and it left her, and immediately she arose. It's just going to have to be one or the other. And it left her, and immediately she arose in Minister 2.